Before aviation had rules, it had personalities, and sometimes the future of flight depended not on the smartest engineer, but on which pilot showed up sober, prepared, and still alive the next morning. Today's story is about two men who flew the same skies, worked the same routes, and answered the same questions in completely different ways. One was lightning, brilliant, violent, impossible to contain. The other was the power grid, steady, disciplined, and the reason the system didn't collapse. This is the story of aviation's ultimate odd couple, Bert Acosta, the bad boy of the air, and Dean Cullen Smith, the man who kept it flying. I'm Bill, and this is Buffalo Air Park. Let's dive in. If the Golden Age of Aviation had a personality spectrum, Bert Acosta and Dean Smith sat at opposite ends. Bert was the natural, the kind of pilot who didn't learn to fly so much as he decided he already knew how. In 1910, at just 15 years old, he built his own airplane and taught himself how to use it. Later, legendary aviatrix Eleanor Smith put it best. Bert didn't fly an airplane, he wore it. His peers were more blunt. They said Bert could have flown a barn door if it had wings. Dean Smith was cut from an entirely different cloth. In 1917, also at 17 years old, Dean became the youngest flight instructor in U.S. Army history. He had fewer than 57 flight hours when the Army decided he was qualified to teach grown men not how to die in the air. Which tells you a lot about Dean, and even more about how wild early aviation really was. By the early 1920s, both men found themselves flying for the U.S. Airmail service, a job that was less about delivery and more about survival. Bert helped map the first transcontinental routes, surveying more than 60 American towns to figure out where a plane could land without hitting a church steeple. He once called that work his most outstanding accomplishment, which says something coming from a man who chased records for sport. Dean, meanwhile, earned his legend on the infamous Hell's Stretch over the Allegheny Mountains, one of the deadliest sections of the mail system. And then there's the telegram. After his engine quit and he was forced to land in a pasture, Dean sent this message to his boss. On trip 4 westbound, flying low, engine quit, only place to land, on cow, killed cow, wrecked plane, scared me, Smith. No drama, no excuses, just facts, and a dead cow. That was Dean Smith in a nutshell. The moment that truly binds these two men happened in April 1927. Bert Acosta was taking off in a Belanca monoplane, attempting a world endurance record, when a bolt sheared, and one of the wheels fell clean off the aircraft. Dean Smith saw it happen from the ground. Without hesitation, he jumped into his own plane and chased Bert into the air. A mechanic leaned out of the cockpit, holding a spare wheel, trying to signal what had happened. Bert got the message. He stayed airborne anyway, for 51 hours, and then landed the aircraft on one wheel like it was just another Tuesday. Lightning and power grid, working together just long enough to keep the lights on. Both men later worked under Richard Byrd, but again, their paths couldn't have been more different. Bert served as chief pilot for Byrd's 1927 transatlantic flight aboard the America. He managed to lift a staggering 15,000 pounds off a muddy, undersized runway, an extraordinary feat of skill. But the flight itself was tense. Storms, zero visibility, and frayed nerves. Legend, possibly apocryphal, but too good to ignore, says Byrd eventually had to strike Bert with a flashlight or a fire extinguisher just to get him to settle down. Dean Smith, on the other hand, became the backbone of Byrd's Antarctic expedition a year later. He spent more than 70 hours flying over frozen wasteland, discovering new land, and rescuing stranded crews. When asked what impressed him most about the South Pole, Dean replied that it was the silence, explaining that it was probably because no woman had ever been there. Dry humor, cold continent, mission accomplished. The difference between lightning and infrastructure shows itself most clearly at the end. Bert Acosta never slowed down. He lost his license repeatedly for stunting, flying under bridges, buzzing buildings, pushing limits just because they were there. He ended up a mercenary pilot in the Spanish Civil War, broke and disillusioned. He died in a sanatorium at 59. One biographer summed it up perfectly. Cancer did what his restless heart could never. It took him home to a well-earned and everlasting rest. Dean Smith took the opposite path. He left the cockpit for the boardroom, becoming an executive at American Airlines, United, and Douglas Aircraft. He lived to be 87, respected, steady, and still part of aviation's future long after the danger faded. If early aviation was a high-performance engine, Bert Acosta was the spark, hot, brilliant, and always on the edge of catastrophe. Dean Smith was the oil, the quiet force that kept the whole thing from tearing itself apart. Both were necessary. Both were extraordinary. And neither makes sense without the other. And that wraps up another tale from aviation's stranger side. Until next time, keep your eyes on the skies.